There was a breath in the walls of Bayview Rest, a breath that hadn't exhaled in decades, trapped behind the locked door of room number 9. Every smile in that house masked an old wound, and every guest brought more than just luggage. They carried secrets heavy enough to sink in silence. Miss Marple sensed it immediately. This wasn't just a seaside guest house. It was a mausoleum of guilt, where time itself had become a witness to murder. Bayview Rest stood once more, its windows polished and shutters drawn back, allowing the sultanged air of the Dorset coast to creep gently into corners that had long held their breath. Mrs. Northam, though slightly stooped and slower now, moved through the house with the practiced familiarity of someone who knew precisely which floorboard would protest, and which drawer still stuck at the edge. It had been 8 years since the house last welcomed paying guests, 8 years since her husband's passing, and 8 years since the door at the far end of the upper corridor had been quietly locked, never mentioned again. She had not intended to reopen the place, but something, whether the creeping loneliness of widowhood or the practical urgencies of dwindling finances, had persuaded her otherwise. Now, with fresh linen on the beds and a bell restored to the reception desk, the house stirred back into life. The past, however, did not dissipate with polish and rose-scented soap. In some places, it lingered. In others, it watched. And as the first guest stepped over the threshold and into the parlor, Bayview Rest exhaled a memory it had never quite let go of. The new guests arrived by varying degrees of promptness and cheer. Miss Lydia Crane, tall and self-contained, unpacked her books with care and requested tea without sugar. Colonel Brathwaite, formerly of India, retained the clipped assurance of a man accustomed to giving orders, though now his battlegrounds were crossword puzzles and breakfast menus. Julian Lyle, a quiet writer with the look of someone always measuring silence, had taken the corner room with the view of the sea. And then there was Miss Marple. She had not intended to stay more than a fortnight, her doctor recommending sea air and gentle walks. Yet her eyes, deceptively soft and pale, missed nothing. She noticed, for instance, that Mrs. Northam's hands trembled when pouring tea, and that Maisie, the young maid, glanced nervously towards the hallway before carrying trays upstairs. Conversations around the fireplace were mannered, warm, even, but no one mentioned the far end of the corridor. It was, Miss Marple thought, not the presence of tension that intrigued her most, but the precise way it was being politely ignored. The upper corridor was narrow, lined with faded seascapes and brass lamps that emitted more shadow than light. It ended in a door painted the same color as the others, but its handle bore the faint tarnish of disuse. Its threshold was the only one free of scuff or polish. Room number 9, Miss Marple noted, was not on the guest list, nor did it appear on the neat map hung behind the reception desk. Maisie, when pressed lightly, admitted she had never cleaned it. Mrs. Northam herself saw to it. "Just storage," she muttered, her tone clipped and final. But there was something off in that silence, a silence that felt practiced communal. Even the guests, it seemed, walked past that door with an unconscious quickening of step. Miss Marple, never one to meddle without reason, simply filed it away, as one files away the single plate missing from a perfect set. She had learned long ago that in such places, the things not spoken of were often the only things worth knowing. It was on the third night that the weather turned. The wind, always present on the coast, rose in fury, rattling shutters and tossing garden chairs across the lawn. The rain came in sheets, slapping against the bay windows and drowning even the creak of the ancient staircase. Electricity flickered, once, twice, and then held. Guests retired early, some with novels, others with nightcaps, but not all found sleep. Lydia Crane, seated upright in bed, would later recall the sound quite distinctly, though she hesitated to describe it. It was not the wind, nor the house groaning beneath the storm. It was lower, closer, as if someone were speaking on the other side of the wall, a voice too indistinct for words, yet laced with urgency. Miss Marple heard nothing, but she did rise once in the night, her candle throwing long shadows along the corridor. She passed room 9 and paused, not because of sound or movement, but because the air itself felt wrong, heavy with something unnamed. The next morning, the sun returned, diffusing the night's unease in beams of warmth across the breakfast table. But the unease had not lifted. It had merely changed shape. By mid-morning, it was clear that Julian Lyle had not come down to breakfast. His tea tray, left outside his door, remained untouched. The door itself, when knocked upon, yielded no response. Colonel Brathwaite, with military briskness, fetched the key from Mrs. Northam's drawer and entered. The room appeared undisturbed. The bed made. The window latched. Julian's suitcase stood by the wardrobe. His coat hung neatly on its peg. Only his shoes were absent. There was no note, no sign of haste. It was, Miss Marple reflected later, the sort of emptiness that felt too deliberate. Mrs. Northam, visibly shaken, suggested he might have gone for an early walk, perhaps to sketch or take notes by the cliffs. But the storm had been fierce. The ground still sodden. No footprints led away from the garden gate. The village constable was summoned, though more as formality than suspicion. No one yet dared speak of worse possibilities. Miss Marple, standing once more outside room 9, wondered, not for the first time, whether absence always meant departure, or if, in some cases, it meant concealment. It was Maisie, white-faced and trembling, who came forward at tea-time with the strangest report. She had been descending the attic stairs late in the night, fetching extra blankets, when she had seen it. A faint glow, unmistakable, behind the frosted glass of room 9. "But it's locked," Mrs. Northam replied, too quickly. "No one uses it." "I know, ma'am," Maisie whispered. "That's why I didn't tell you straight away. But I saw the light. I swear it." Miss Marple said nothing. She merely stirred her tea once, set down her spoon, and looked thoughtfully into the steam. She asked mildly whether any of the guests smoked. Mrs. Northam blinked. "Mr. Lyle had a pipe," she said slowly, "but he never lit it indoors." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked the upstairs corridor alone. She stopped again outside room 9. The keyhole was still stuffed with wax, a crude but effective seal. Yet, when she placed her hand upon the handle, she fancied she felt something. Not resistance, but warmth. It was nonsense, of course, age and imagination, and yet she had long since learned not to ignore the nonsensical, for very often it was where truth insisted on hiding. Miss Lydia Crane had arrived with little ceremony, and even less conversation. Her suitcase was sturdy, her clothing plain and precise, and her manner suggested a preference for solitude. Yet it was her hands that drew Miss Marple's quiet attention, pale, unadorned hands, marked with faint ridges of old scarring, the sort that might have come from years spent near chemicals or heat, though none at the table thought to ask. Miss Marple, however, did not forget such things. Lydia took her meals punctually, read in the mornings, and walked in the afternoons. There was something guarded in her eyes, not quite suspicion, but a firm determination to keep the world at arm's length. Miss Marple observed her interactions with the other guests, minimal, courteous, and withdrawn. The schoolmistress, for such Miss Marple soon deduced her to be, bore the air of one accustomed to managing the difficult and suppressing the unnecessary. It was not dislike that Miss Marple felt toward her, but a sense that Lydia Crane, more than the others, was attempting to remain unnoticed, and in a place like Bayview Rest that, in itself, was worthy of notice. And there, Miss Marple thought, lay the beginning of something. Colonel Brathwaite, by contrast, made no effort to conceal himself. He announced his opinions at breakfast with military precision and offered unsolicited commentary on everything from the eggs to international diplomacy. His mustache was formidable, his spectacles perpetually smudged, and his sense of personal authority unshaken by retirement. He carried with him a small, battered leather notebook, which he consulted frequently, and guarded rather more closely than a man might guard a crossword solution. Miss Marple, whose eyes were better than she allowed, caught the glint of small names and dates beneath his stub of a pencil. No one else seemed to notice or care. They had already filed him away under the harmless eccentricities of age and service. Yet something about the colonel's writing habit struck her as curious. It was not the idle scrawl of a retired man seeking distraction, nor the diary of a sentimental veteran. It was rather the kind of methodical note-taking one observed in people still cataloging something or someone. He had made reference more than once to knowing a thing or two about truth, even when it's inconvenient. Miss Marple said nothing aloud, but tucked that comment beside his notebook in the filing cabinet of her mind. It might mean nothing, but then again it rarely did. Vera Entwistle was of a different sort entirely, bright-eyed and sharp-tongued, despite her considerable years. She had the air of a woman who had once been formidable and still knew it. Deafness had not softened her opinions. It had merely made her more direct. "I was here once," she declared over her third cup of tea. "1944, during the war. My cousin Hetty was the housekeeper then. I visited for a fortnight when I had leave." She said this lightly, but her eyes did not match the tone. Something deeper, more complex, lingered beneath the memory. She paused, set her teacup down with uncharacteristic care, and added softly, "There was trouble that year. Something hushed up. I never did get the truth of it." Miss Marple leaned in, her expression politely interested. Vera said no more. She only looked briefly toward the staircase, then changed the subject to the poor quality of seaside currant buns. But Miss Marple had heard enough. In a house where silence clung to certain doors, it was the elderly who often remembered things no one else wished to recall. And sometimes they remembered too well. Outside Bayview Rest, in the narrow streets of Lime Street, Wilfred, the past was not entirely forgotten. At the post office, in the grocer's queue, and behind the vicarage hedge, murmurs began to stir once more. The writer's disappearance had awakened old talk, and it had not taken long for the name Northam to resurface. Miss Marple, with her usual gentility, engaged the fishmonger's wife in conversation regarding the merits of mackerel, only to be informed, quite unprompted, that Mr. Harold Northam had drowned in tragic circumstances. "Very sudden," the woman added, lowering her voice, as if the tide might overhear. Never did get a proper explanation, but then folks stopped asking. That silence, Miss Marple reflected, had not come about through resolution, but through effort. It was the kind of silence that settled when too many people found it convenient not to remember. She returned to the guest house with the distinct feeling that the sea had not merely claimed a man. It had covered something that was meant to remain submerged. But tides, as she knew, had a habit of turning. In the parlor, tucked beneath the frilled edge of a lace doily, was an album of photographs, mostly faded groupings of visitors, wartime volunteers, and the occasional beach scene. It was Vera Entwistle who drew it out, laughing at her own appearance in one of the earlier frames. "Look at me. Third from the left, and not a gray hair in sight." Vera chuckled, tapping the edge of the photo. Miss Marple took up the album with interest, turning the pages slowly. Her eyes settled on a photograph dated August 1944, a gathering of officers on the terrace, drinks in hand. One figure stood apart, partially in shadow, his gaze fixed elsewhere. Lydia Crane, seated nearby, glanced up from her book and froze. Her fingers tightened, ever so slightly, on the pages. Miss Marple did not miss the motion, nor did she miss the way Lydia rose a moment later, excused herself with quiet civility, and left the room. The photograph remained open. Miss Marple studied it again. There was something unresolved in the posture of the man in shadow, something that reached across decades. She closed the album gently, knowing that Lydia's retreat had not been prompted by recognition alone, but by something far more dangerous, memory. Maisie, the maid, was not one given to dramatics. She worked diligently, moved quietly, and avoided corridors that gave her chills. But in the pantry, with no one else about, she ventured a confidence to Miss Marple, drawn out by a kind word and a comforting presence. "It were months ago, just before the place reopened," Maisie whispered, eyes darting toward the stairs. "I was fetching linens late, no one else about, and I heard it from room 9. A sound," Miss Marple prompted gently. "A sound like someone crying." She hesitated. Not loud, just steady, like they didn't want to be heard. Miss Marple's voice remained light. "And did you tell anyone?" Maisie shook her head. "Mrs. Northam said I must have imagined it." Miss Marple said nothing more. She merely thanked the girl and turned away, her thoughts sharpening. Imagined sounds, dismissed staff, and a locked door that seemed to listen. Later that afternoon, As the others rested or took their walks, Miss Marple ascended the stairs. She moved slowly, her tread soft upon the carpet runner, and paused. Not out of fatigue, but observation. Room number 9, untouched, betrayed no sound. But on the wooden floor, just before its door, beneath the curve of an old brass wall sconce, lay something quite telling. A footprint. It was faint, made in fine dust. But it was there. The impression of a man's shoe, angled oddly, as though made by someone who had paused, turned, and perhaps looked back. Miss Marple bent slightly, studying the print. The housekeeper had claimed no one had been near the room in weeks. The dust ought to have settled undisturbed. And yet there it was. The house held its breath once more. But Miss Marple did not. She descended the stairs with purpose, knowing now that the silence surrounding room 9 was not mere habit. It was protection. The sea, having spent the night churning restlessly beneath gray skies, receded that morning with its usual indifferent rhythm, leaving behind its offerings to the shingle. Among the shells and twisted kelp, a fisherman named Tom Welby came upon something far less expected. The body of a man, crumpled and pale, wedged between two blackened rocks, his arms stretched in an unnatural pose, as though reaching for something long vanished. It was Julian Lyle. News spread swiftly, in the way such things always did in quiet places. By the time the police arrived from the larger town a few miles inland, the villagers had already formed their conclusions, whispered, and exchanged at shop counters and bus stops. Miss Marple, however, did not speak. She had risen early, and upon hearing the news, quietly placed her knitting to one side and requested her tea without lemon. The location of the body troubled her. The rocks were difficult to reach, treacherous, even in calm weather. For a man like Julian, not prone to wanderings or risk, it made little sense. But the tide had brought him back, and in doing so, had unsettled not just the surface of things, but the foundation beneath them. Something, Miss Marple felt, had not been carried out to sea. It had been left behind deliberately. The coroner's verdict was prompt and uninspired. Death by accidental fall, consistent with the slippery nature of the rocks and the previous night storm. No signs of struggle. No water in the lungs. A tragedy, the constable murmured solemnly, but nothing to suggest foul play. Miss Marple listened carefully to the report and said nothing of her doubts, at least not aloud. Her experience had taught her that the most efficient way to uncover the truth was to allow others the comfort of their own assumptions. But in private, she turned the matter over with care. Julian Lyle had been cautious. He had not ventured far, had taken his tea regularly, and had shown no inclination toward dramatic gestures. His behavior had been thoughtful, observant, almost as though he had come to Bayview Rest not for respite, but for answers. Accidental falls did occur, but coincidences, in Miss Marple's mind, had a peculiar way of arranging themselves when someone wished them to. And then there was the locked room. She could not help but wonder, was it truly the tide that had claimed him? Or something, or someone within the house itself? Constable Burrows, a man whose shoes were always freshly polished, conducted a search of Julian Lyle's room with professional detachment. The results were, by all appearances, unremarkable. His suitcase remained unopened, his clothes folded with an almost obsessive neatness. On the writing desk rested a single fountain pen uncapped, but dry. His spectacles sat beside a teacup, undrunk. Nothing, it seemed, had been packed. Nothing had been taken. Yet one thing was missing: the notebook. Julian had been observed with it several times, jotting in the garden, scratching lines at breakfast, turning pages in thoughtful silence. Now it was nowhere to be found. When asked, the staff professed ignorance. The guest shrugged or frowned, offering the vague concern owed to such losses. Miss Marple, however, made her own inquiry. That evening, while passing the corridor, she paused outside room number 9 once more. The air was colder there, not with a draft, but with the kind of chill that comes from an unspoken presence. She noticed, quite deliberately, that the wax which once sealed the keyhole had cracked. She said nothing to Mrs. Northam, whose face had grown paler by the hour, nor to Maisie, whose glances were now fixed steadfastly on the floor. But she noted the absence, not just of the notebook, but of a truth. the kind that tries very hard to stay hidden behind locked doors. Miss Lydia Crane, who had, until then, remained composed in her manner and precise in her habits, began to unravel in small and telling ways. Her walks grew shorter. Her meals, once eaten with mechanical efficiency, were left half-finished. Her hands, always steady, now trembled when pouring tea. On the morning following the discovery of Julian's body, she requested her bill. Mrs. Northam, confused but obliging, accepted the request. Miss Marple, observing from her seat by the window, said nothing until she met Lydia on the stair. She offered no confrontation, only the gentlest inquiry. "Has the sea air proven too damp?" Lydia hesitated. There was something trapped behind her eyes. Not fear, precisely, but recognition. Her ghost, she knew too well, had reappeared, and she wished to flee before it spoke. Miss Marple spoke again, softer this time, about the importance of endings, and how truth, however uncomfortable, has a tendency to rise. By afternoon, Lydia had postponed her departure, but her resolve had thinned, and Miss Marple, patient as ever, knew that some truths did not need to be pursued. They simply needed time to rise to the surface, like a body carried ashore. At supper, the colonel was particularly vocal. The recent events had stirred within him a sense of righteous recollection, and he spoke at length about war, honor, and the failures of younger generations. But amid his bluster, one remark struck an unusual chord. "Unfinished wars," he said abruptly, lowering his fork. "That's what this house feels like. Full of officers who never reported back, orders half-written, files left open." The table fell momentarily silent. Miss Marple looked up, her expression unreadable. Colonel Brathwaite cleared his throat, then muttered something about faded memories, and resumed his meal. But the words lingered. She had not previously given much weight to the house's wartime past. Vera and Twistle had spoken of visits in 1944, of a cousin who had served here. Yet now, with Julian's death, the locked room, and Lydia's fear, the pieces began to suggest something more precise. There were wars that took place in fields and trenches, and there were wars of silence, fought in drawing rooms and seaside guest houses, where secrets were held as tightly as military codes. Miss Marple suspected the colonel knew more than he admitted, and perhaps, in his own way, regretted surviving what others had not. The Morning Post, usually comprised of catalogs and indifferent bills, brought with it a single envelope that caught Miss Marple's attention, not for what it said, but to whom it was addressed. It bore the name Harold Northam. Mrs. Northam stared at it for a long time before opening it. When she did, her hand faltered. It was a plain letter, typewritten, unsigned. The message was brief. "The truth has been walking these corridors again. You must know that." She made no announcement, no complaint. She simply placed the letter into her handbag and asked Maisie to bring her a cup of tea. Miss Marple, who had read much in her time, in books and people, and in glances, read something new in Mrs. Northam that morning. Not fear, but a reluctant acceptance. Sometimes, she thought, the dead receive letters that the living are too afraid to read. Later that day, while the household busied itself with its usual afternoon hush, Miss Marple took a solitary turn along the cliff path. The sky had cleared. The grass was still damp beneath her shoes. She walked without destination, trusting instinct rather than map. And it was there that she saw him. The gardener, old, nearly mute, kneeling in the loam. He worked with slow deliberation, pressing something small and wrapped into the soil before covering it again with earth. No one else appeared to notice or care. Miss Marple did not disturb him. She walked on, but in her mind she catalogued the action, the precise care with which it was done, the almost ritualistic way the soil was replaced. It was not weeds he was tending to. The earth, she knew, keeps secrets well, but gardeners, she had found, often knew when to bury and when to reveal, and something, she felt, was about to bloom. "There are moments," Miss Marple often said, "when the past chooses to announce itself, not loudly, but unmistakably." Such a moment occurred when Vera Ann Twistle, her memory sharpened by sentiment, retrieved a dusty album from the bottom shelf of the parlor cabinet. "I used to be quite the fixture here," Vera declared cheerfully. "War years. Hetty ran the place then. Everything smelled of boot polish and boiled cabbage. The album's pages were thick with time, corners curling, ink faded but still legible. Names and dates: August 1944, December 1943. Then the page near the center caught Miss Marple's eye. It was a group photograph. 6 or 7 figures in uniform, arranged haphazardly along the terrace wall. One stood at a slight angle, not smiling, his hands tucked behind him, his face partly in shadow. The features were younger, but the brow and jaw were unmistakable. Julian Lyle. Miss Marple held the page for a moment longer, her fingers lightly tracing the inked caption below. "Officers' Weekend, Bayview Rest, August 1944. There was no mention of Ale, but Julian's presence in that photograph was beyond dispute. She closed the album slowly, not with finality, but with the sense that something long closed had just quietly reopened. Later that day, in the hushed quiet of the drawing room, Miss Marple made an unassuming remark about the photograph. Mrs. Northam's teacup halted midair before continuing to her lips. "My husband was a major then," she said, voice level. "He was stationed here. Unofficially, of course. Intelligence work, not something one spoke of." There was a pause. Not long enough to feel awkward, but just long enough to notice. She had not previously given much weight to the house's wartime past. Vera and Twistle had spoken of visits in 1944, of a cousin who had served here. Yet now, with Julian's death, the locked room, and Lydia's fear, the pieces began to suggest something more precise. There were wars that took place in fields and trenches, and there were wars of silence, fought in drawing rooms and seaside guest houses, where secrets were held as tightly as military codes. Miss Marple suspected the colonel knew more than he admitted, and perhaps, in his own way, regretted surviving what others had not. The Morning Post, usually comprised of catalogs and indifferent bills, brought with it a single envelope that caught Miss Marple's attention, not for what it said, but to whom it was addressed. It bore the name Harold Northam. Mrs. Northam stared at it for a long time before opening it. When she did, her hand faltered. It was a plain letter, typewritten, unsigned. The message was brief. "The truth has been walking these corridors again. You must know that." She made no announcement, no complaint. She simply placed the letter into her handbag and asked Maisie to bring her a cup of tea. Miss Marple, who had read much in her time, in books and people, and in glances, read something new in Mrs. Northam that morning. Not fear, but a reluctant acceptance. Sometimes, she thought, the dead receive letters that the living are too afraid to read. Later that day, while the household busied itself with its usual afternoon hush, Miss Marple took a solitary turn along the cliff path. The sky had cleared. The grass was still damp beneath her shoes. She walked without destination, trusting instinct rather than map. And it was there that she saw him. The gardener, old, nearly mute, kneeling in the loam. He worked with slow deliberation, pressing something small and wrapped into the soil before covering it again with earth. No one else appeared to notice or care. Miss Marple did not disturb him. She walked on, but in her mind she catalogued the action, the precise care with which it was done, the almost ritualistic way the soil was replaced. It was not weeds he was tending to. The earth, she knew, keeps secrets well, but gardeners, she had found, often knew when to bury and when to reveal, and something, she felt, was about to bloom. "There are moments," Miss Marple often said, "when the past chooses to announce itself, not loudly, but unmistakably." Such a moment occurred when Vera Ann Twistle, her memory sharpened by sentiment, retrieved a dusty album from the bottom shelf of the parlor cabinet. "I used to be quite the fixture here," Vera declared cheerfully. "War years. Hetty ran the place then. Everything smelled of boot polish and boiled cabbage. The album's pages were thick with time, corners curling, ink faded but still legible. Names and dates: August 1944, December 1943. Then the page near the center caught Miss Marple's eye. It was a group photograph. 6 or 7 figures in uniform, arranged haphazardly along the terrace wall. One stood at a slight angle, not smiling, his hands tucked behind him, his face partly in shadow. The features were younger, but the brow and jaw were unmistakable. Julian Lyle. Miss Marple held the page for a moment longer, her fingers lightly tracing the inked caption below. Officers' Weekend, Bayview Rest, August 1944. There was no mention of Ale, but Julian's presence in that photograph was beyond dispute. She closed the album slowly, not with finality, but with the sense that something long closed had just quietly reopened. Later that day, in the hushed quiet of the drawing room, Miss Marple made an unassuming remark about the photograph. Mrs. Northam's teacup halted midair before continuing to her lips. "My husband was a major then," she said, voice level. "He was stationed here. Unofficially, of course. Intelligence work, not something one spoke of." There was a pause. Not long enough to feel awkward, but just long enough to notice. "After the war, he stayed on a while," she added. Said the house had grown on him, but it never sat quite right with him again. Not after certain things. Her tone shifted, not to confession, but to weary recollection. "Men came and went," she murmured. "None of them used real names. We kept records, but they meant nothing. Code names. Numbers. Bayview was useful. Quiet. Unremarkable. Near the sea." Miss Marple did not press further. She merely nodded, as if such arrangements were as natural as parish cake sales. But in her mind, the lines were forming. A photograph, a name unspoken, and a guest who had returned not for nostalgia, but for unfinished business. There are doors that are shut for storage. Others are shut to be forgotten. Room number 9, as Mrs. Northam reluctantly admitted, had once been her husband's study, though she preferred to call it the office. During the war, it had served as the hub of whatever operations were quietly funneled through Bayview Rest. Telegrams, documents, conversations held behind closed doors, exchanged in guarded glances. After Major Northam's death, officially a drowning, unofficially a tragedy best not discussed, the room had been sealed. Not out of sentiment, Mrs. Northam insisted, but out of respect for what had passed. No one went in after. There was no need. I had it locked. We never used it again. Miss Marple did not ask why the key had vanished or why the housekeeper claimed it was bricked up, when clearly it was not. She simply accepted the information, as one accepts a misplaced teaspoon, notable only because it once had a place and now did not. And so, room number 9 remained as it was, untouched, unswept, unspoken, but not, Miss Marple felt, unvisited. Someone had entered. She was now quite sure of it. It was Miss Marple's manner, calm, grandmotherly, never intrusive, that finally led Lydia Crane to speak. Not in confrontation, but in quiet confession, over tepid tea in the library. "I was stationed here," Lydia began. "Not officially. We weren't supposed to say we were ever here at all." Her voice faltered, then continued. "I was part of a clerical unit, copying intercepted messages. Most of it was meaningless, numbers, initials. But once in a while," she trailed off then more quietly, "there was a man named Edward. He wasn't like the others. He noticed things. Listened. I don't know why he trusted me, but he did. We weren't meant to form attachments. It was discouraged, naturally. But we did. Or at least, I thought we did." She looked down at her hands, still bearing the quiet marks of work and worry. "One night he didn't come back. They said he'd been transferred, but there was no record. Nothing. I asked too many times. Then I was reassigned." Her words were brittle now. "I never knew what happened. I tried to forget. But when I saw Julian, I thought it was Edward at first, or someone meant to remind me of him." Miss Marple said nothing. She simply reached for the teapot and poured another cup, as if memory itself were a guest needing gentle hospitality. In the village, people forget little and remember oddly. A fisherman named Acoli, bent by salt and years, recalled an encounter from 2 summers past. A polite young man, quiet, asking questions no tourist had reason to ask. Wanted to know about the old base, Acauley muttered, scratching at his beard. The one near the cliffs. Said he was writing about the war. Didn't say much more. The man had matched the description of Julian Lyle, though he had given another name. Something dull and forgettable, which now eluded him entirely. But the intensity, Acauley added. The note of insistence beneath the polite tone that lingered. He asked about drownings. About a man who went missing here during the war. Didn't say why. MissMarple thanked him kindly, but in her thoughts, a picture was emerging, not of a writer in search of fiction, but of a man in search of his own origin. Julian had not come to Bayview by chance. He had come to the place where questions had once been silenced, hoping, perhaps, that the sea might give up what it had taken. Back at Bayview Rest, MissMarple requested the guest book, a large, leather-bound volume whose pages bore the careful penmanship of decades. She turned to the entries for the year Julian had visited, the one no one had known of until now. There it was. The handwriting was different, firmer, more angular, but unmistakably the same hand that had written poetry fragments on breakfast napkins just days earlier. The name, however, was not Lyle. James Linton, it read. Address vague. Purpose, quiet study. MissMarple closed the book, letting her fingers rest upon the spine. Forged names were commonplace in wartime, but to use one now, for a visit meant to disturb the past, suggested something else entirely. Julian had not merely sought information. He had sought it quietly. He had sought it alone. And now he had paid for it. MissMarple stood. The faintest chill settled over her. Behind her, the parlor clock chimed. A breeze stirred the edge of the curtain. There was a name not spoken in that house, a room not entered, and a death that had come too close to its echo. Some truths, she thought, prefer to remain hidden, but not all of them succeed. Colonel Brathwaite, never one to withhold an opinion, had taken to pontificating more loudly in recent days. A trait, MissMarple noted, that often accompanied nervousness, poorly disguised as indignation. Over breakfast, he declared with great authority that the deceased Mr. Lyle had been engaged in a discreet investigation into pension fraud within military circles. The colonel claimed to have spoken with him privately, asserting that Julian had uncovered discrepancies involving the benefits of wartime intelligence officers. He was on to something, he insisted. Quite a serious matter. No wonder the poor fellow came to grief. MissMarple, stirring her tea gently, merely nodded. The others appeared to accept the notion with varying degrees of interest. Vera Entwistle murmured that she had always found war pensions a mystery, while Lydia Crane's eyes remained fixed on the garden. But the theory, MissMarple thought, served too many purposes, too neatly. It explained Julian's presence. It cast a shroud of honor over his death. And, most conveniently, it drew attention away from Bayview Rest itself. And yet, there had been nothing in Julian's behavior to suggest an accountant's pursuit. His gaze had been personal, not administrative. The colonel's insistence, though loud, felt too rehearsed. And rehearsed things, in MissMarple's experience, were seldom true. It was in the still hush of late afternoon, while strolling along the herbaceous border, that MissMarple and Lydia Crane spoke once more. The sun glinted softly upon the lavender beds, and the air carried that delicate warmth which encouraged confidences. Lydia walked slowly, her hands clasped before her as though bracing herself against the weight of her own thoughts. "I believe he was Edward's son," she said at last, barely above a whisper. "Julian." MissMarple did not reply immediately, allowing the silence to settle before prompting gently. "What led you to that conclusion?" Lydia's voice was steadier now. The way he looked at the house, with familiarity, not curiosity. He knew things he ought to know. And his eyes, they were so like Edward's. "I thought it impossible at first, but he came here for answers. That much I'm certain of." She drew a breath, steadying herself. Edward disappeared without explanation. They said he drowned, but there was no body, no confirmation, just absence. And this boy, this man, arrived with questions no one had ever dared to ask. MissMarple looked toward the old hedgerow, already overgrown, and wondered how many truths lay buried there. A son searching for a name was not uncommon, But sometimes it was the truth that waited patiently for the child to come of age. The memories of the elderly, Miss Marple had often observed, came in two forms: unreliable details and unforgiving emotions. It was the latter that surfaced when Vera Entwistle, seated by the wireless with her knitting, spoke as if to no one in particular. "There was a night," she said, adjusting a dropped stitch, "when voices rose behind that door. Room 9. I remember because it was the only time my cousin, the housekeeper then, turned up the music on purpose." Miss Marple, seated nearby with her embroidery, listened without interruption. It was a woman's voice, angry, trembling, and a man's, not shouting exactly, but determined. She said his name, Edward, just once. I'd not forgotten it. She looked up then, her eyes sharper than one might expect. There was silence after that, a long one. Then the door opened, and I heard nothing more. Next morning, he was gone. They told us he'd been transferred, but no one ever saw him leave. The needles clicked again. Miss Marple said nothing, but the story had the ring of truth, not because it was neat, but because it was jagged. The past had not only visited Bayview, it had stayed. The gardener, who spoke rarely, and observed more than he showed, approached Miss Marple with a curious offering, a small, rusted tin, unearthed while clearing behind the hearth in the disused servant's wing. Inside lay several old keys, some tarnished, others surprisingly intact. One bore a faded tag, illegible, but familiar in shape and size. Miss Marple took them gently, turning the largest one between her fingers. It had a particular weight, and a slight curve, worn smooth by frequent use. Her expression did not alter, but her heartbeat quickened by a hair's breadth. "Old things," the gardener muttered, "meant to be left be." Miss Marple only nodded. "And yet," she murmured, "sometimes the old things are the ones that matter most." She did not ask permission. That evening, once the house had settled and the light had softened into that gray hush between dusk and supper, she ascended the stairs with the keys tucked quietly in her palm. There was no grand intention, only a need for the truth to step forward from behind a door it had occupied for too long. What one finds behind locked doors is never what one imagines, but what one imagines is often quite close. The key turned with unexpected ease. Miss Marple stepped across the threshold into room number 9, with neither trepidation nor haste. The air was close, but not foul, simply stale with time. Dust lay upon the furniture in a thin, undisturbed veil. And yet, there was no true decay. The room had not been abandoned, it had been preserved. Her eyes moved gently from object to object. The desk, still bearing blotting paper curled at the corners. The lamp, oddly turned at an angle, as if someone had repositioned it, and then left hurriedly. A teacup, long since emptied, yet bearing the outline of a lip. These were not relics. They were remnants. What drew her attention, however, was the lampshade. It was slightly off-center, not as one might leave it through forgetfulness, but intentionally. A small disruption in an otherwise still world. She approached and, with gloved fingers, adjusted it back to its natural position. Nothing beneath. Yet something behind the bureau caught her notice, a panel, ever so slightly ajar. Not loose, not broken, simply not quite right. Rooms did not lie. They held silence, but they did not deceive. This one had waited a long time to be entered, and now, with dust stirred and history breathing again, it would finally speak. The panel yielded gently, revealing a narrow space behind it. There, tucked into the recess with deliberate care, was a notebook, thin, cloth-bound, the kind Julian had been seen with on the lawn days before. Miss Marple withdrew it without haste. The pages were written in a neat, precise hand, observations, dates, names. And amidst the entries, one stood out, a single name, encircled in red pencil. Northam. It appeared more than once. Not in accusation, but in connection. Julian had drawn lines between the name and others, constructing a web that linked not only people, but places, times, whispers. He had not stumbled upon the truth. He had mapped it. Miss Marple closed the notebook, her thoughts quiet. The truth had not vanished with Julian. It had simply hidden itself in a room long denied. And now it had returned to the light. On the last page, written in firmer strokes, were words that did not ask, but stated, "I know what happened on the stairs. I know who killed him." There was no date, no signature, but the intent was final. Miss Marple stared at the line, unblinking. The notebook had not been lost. It had been concealed. By Julian himself, perhaps, or by another who feared what he had uncovered. What occurred on those stairs decades ago had echoed again. Not a repetition, but a reckoning. And now, the truth stood ready, not to be guessed, but to be known. There was no formal summons. Miss Marple merely suggested, with gentle insistence, that tea might be taken together in the parlor. Mrs. Northam agreed, with a nod just a little too slow to be natural. The other guests, drawn more by the atmosphere than by appetite, assembled with tentative curiosity. The china was set out as always, the lemon slices neatly arranged, the biscuits untouched. The wind rattled faintly at the window panes, as if unwilling to let the house remain silent. Miss Marple, seated where the light fell most softly across her knitting bag, poured first for Mrs. Northam, then for Lydia, then the Colonel, then herself. Her voice, when it came, was light, conversational almost. "There are truths," she said mildly, "that insist on returning, no matter how carefully one tries to lock them away." No one interrupted her. Not Vera, whose fingers paused over her embroidery. Not the Colonel, who shifted uncomfortably. Not Lydia, who had gone pale. Miss Marple continued, her tone no firmer than before. Yet, each word drew the air tighter. She did not accuse. She revealed. She did not raise her voice, but the quiet grew so absolute that the ticking clock grew loud. And still she spoke, of memory, of silence, and of the night someone died on the stairs. "There was a man," Miss Marple began, her tone unchanged, "named Edward, not listed among the guests, but known to several in this house during the war. Intelligent, reserved, and I believe in love." Her eyes drifted toward Lydia, who sat frozen, the teacup before her untouched. He and Miss Crane, they cared for each other. I do not suppose it was encouraged. It never is, where secrets are concerned. She turned to Mrs. Northam. "Your husband, Major Northam, knew. Or perhaps he discovered it. I imagine by accident. A letter misplaced. A glance, not quite guarded." Miss Marple's gaze returned to Lydia. "There was a quarrel. I believe it occurred near the top of the back stairs, not far from room number 9. It was heated. Perhaps Harold Northam feared betrayal, professional or personal. Or perhaps he simply feared scandal. No one spoke. He confronted Edward. Perhaps he pushed. Or perhaps Edward, in retreat, lost his footing. The outcome was the same." There was no drama in her voice, only the hush of something long unsaid. At last, a loud breath. And then, Miss Marple concluded gently. A decision was made. Not to report, not to speak, only to close the door, quite literally. The staircase had borne witness, and the house, in its silent watchfulness, had kept the memory sealed, until now. The days that followed Edward's fall were, Miss Marple suspected, less a blur than a fever of deliberation. There would have been panic, grief, fear, but also calculation. Mrs. Northam, loyal to her husband, fearful of disgrace, had chosen to believe the official line. A tragic accident, a mission interrupted, no questions asked. Lydia, young then, and bound by guilt and confusion, accepted the lie. Or rather, helped build it. Her drowning was easily staged in such a place. The sea, always hungry, asked for little, and kept its silence. Room number 9 was locked, its furnishings left precisely as they had been, and with it, the memory of a quarrel that ended in death. Miss Marple did not condemn. Her voice held no reproach, but her manner left no room for doubt. "There was no report," she said quietly. "No closure. Just a silence that was meant to be permanent. But silence," she added, "rarely stays obedient. It ferments. It waits. And when a name returns, whether whispered by a maid or written in red pencil, it knocks again at the same locked door, waiting to be let in." Julian Lyle had not arrived at Bayview Rest by coincidence. That much had become evident. But what had taken longer to understand was the depth of what he sought. He knew, Miss Marple said softly, or at least suspected, that Edward had been his father. There was no reaction at first. Then, Lydia's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair. He didn't come for revenge, nor exposure, Miss Marple continued. He came for history, for something to fit inside his life. He had no bitterness, only questions. Miss Marple paused. And he came to you, Miss Crane, because he believed you had loved Edward. Lydia bowed her head. It was not a gesture of denial. He thought, perhaps, you could tell him who he was, not by blood, but by memory. Miss Marple folded her hands. But the past, when it has been buried too long, does not rise gently. Julian had uncovered too much, and those who carried the truth were not ready to speak it. Her voice remained calm, but now it held the weight of finality. Even kindness, when misguided, can be a dangerous thing, especially when it meets the edge of a cliff. The truth, once unraveled, revealed its symmetry with cruel elegance. Julian had confronted Lydia, not in anger, but with the quiet intensity of a man asking to understand the shadows he had inherited. He had not threatened. He had hoped. But Lydia, burdened by memory and fear, had seen only risk. The return of Edward's name, the unsealing of secrets long stitched into the silence of her days. The past she had built her life upon was cracking beneath his gaze. She had not intended harm. She had meant to warn, to frighten him away, perhaps. But words, when twisted by panic, can wound. There, above the same jagged descent that had once swallowed Edward, she had pleaded, then shouted. The air had thickened with dread. Julian had stepped back, or she had pushed. No one could say with certainty, but he had fallen, and as she stood alone, staring down at the rocks, where another man now lay broken, she realized, the past does not forgive its echoes, and the sea, however vast, does not wash away guilt. It carries it back to shore in time. Lydia did not speak at first. Her eyes, once alert and contained, now brimmed with something deeper. The exhaustion of decades carried too tightly. She turned to Miss Marple, her voice scarcely above breath. I loved them both, and I lost them both. There was no defense in her tone, no evasion, only the ache of a heart that had bound itself in silence too long. The death of Edward had broken something she had never dared examine, and Julian, so like him, had arrived, not as punishment, but as reminder. I tried to forget, she whispered, but forgetting does not bury anything. It only delays the day the door must be opened. Miss Marple reached for the teapot and poured a fresh cup, not because the moment required it, but because tea, in its quiet ritual, offered a kind of mercy. And mercy, even in justice, had its place. There was no scene, no dramatic exodus. Lydia Crane did not weep, nor raise her voice. She descended the staircase in the quiet gray of morning, her suitcase modest, her coat buttoned to the throat. The constable stood beside her, respectful, as though escorting a guest on an early train, rather than a woman carrying the weight of 2 lives lost. Miss Marple met her at the door, a soft shawl folded neatly over one arm. Without a word, she draped it around Lydia's shoulders. It was an old piece, woolen, pale blue, with a faint smell of lavender still clinging to its threads. Lydia looked at her then, not with defiance or gratitude, but with the gaze of someone who no longer feared being seen. I didn't push him, she said very quietly. Miss Marple inclined her head. But you didn't catch him either. The gardener stood a little distance away, his cap in his hand, watching as the car pulled away. He had buried many things in that soil over the years, bulbs, secrets, broken tools, and knew, as gardeners do, that not all things stay buried. Miss Marple turned back into the house. The parlor awaited its final tea. The corridors their silence. But something had shifted. Justice, when it arrives with gentleness, can still be heard. By midday, Mrs. Northam had made her decision. There was no announcement, no formal notice pinned to the gate. She simply informed the remaining guests, with a voice composed but strangely tender, that Bayview Rest would not be taking further bookings. Not this season. Not ever. I reopened the house, she said. in hopes that the past might stay quiet if I kept the windows open. Miss Marple did not correct her. Some illusions are best laid to rest alongside the truth they shielded. The linens were gathered, the shutters closed. The staff were thanked and quietly dismissed. There was no ceremony in it, only the measured acts of a woman reclaiming stillness from a space that had grown too loud with memory. Later, Mrs. Northam stood alone in the doorway, looking out toward the garden. The wind carried the scent of rosemary and something older, less defined. She did not cry. Miss Marple passed her gently on the path, the two women exchanging no words, only a glance of shared understanding. The house would rest now, as it had once done before. But this time, its silence would not be forced. It would be earned. Miss Marple took her customary walk along the sea path, though she did not walk it as she once had, for the sake of health or scenery. Today, her steps were slower, her gaze turned inward more than outward. The cliffs, stoic and weathered, bore the same indifferent face they had shown to generations before. She paused by a patch of wild thyme, where the grass sloped toward the rocks. It had grown fuller since her arrival, the roots no doubt drawing nourishment from something unseen. It occurred to her, as it often did in such places, that time has a curious way of folding in upon itself. What seemed present was often echo. What appeared buried might only be sleeping. She thought of Edward and Julian, two men shaped by the silences of others. One denied his future, the other denied his past. And Lydia, the bridge between them, had borne too much without speaking. Gardens grow, even over graves. That is their nature, not cruelty, but insistence. She had not solved a mystery, not in the conventional sense. She had merely opened a door and allowed the wind to pass through. And in that wind, there had been voices. Miss Marple stood for a long moment by the fence, watching the sea curl and draw itself back again. The tide was neither high nor low, caught in that suspended breath between coming and going. "Time doesn't forget," she murmured, almost to the wind. It was not an accusation, simply an observation, drawn from a sort of quiet conviction that age allows. Time does not hold grudges, but it does remember. Seasons shift, leaves fall, children become orphans without knowing they've been abandoned, and the sea, patient as ever, carries both truth and debris back to shore. Flowers bloom over all of it. She looked down and noticed a single sprig of heather, stubborn and bright, growing from a crevice in the rock. Life does that, she thought. It insists, and yet it forgets nothing. She turned back toward the house, now shuttered, its roof lines soft against the gray sky. It would stand, perhaps, for many more years, or perhaps it would fall. That was not her concern. What mattered was that the past, having found voice, had spoken, and the present, having listened, had allowed it. Miss Marple found the letter after breakfast, tucked between the pages of the Garden Lovers Monthly, which Julian had taken from the parlor bookshelf during his first evening. The paper was not new, the ink slightly smudged, but the handwriting was careful, considered. "If you are reading this, then I was right to trust you. I came here hoping for answers, though I expected none. What I found was more than I deserved. Not facts, but understanding. That's rarer. I think she loved him, you know. I hope she remembers that part. Thank you, whoever you are, for noticing, for seeing what others missed, for seeing me." It was unsigned, but it bore no need of a name. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it beside her knitting. She did not smile nor sigh. She simply sat for a moment longer before rising, placing her shawl around her shoulders, and collecting her gloves. There would be another train, another village, another puzzle in need of mending. But for now, here at Bayview Rest, the threads had been gently knotted, and the past, like the tide, had finally receded. Thank you for joining us for the mystery of Room Number 9, a tale where silence lingered longer than truth, and justice returned, not with thunder, but with the sound of the sea gently reclaiming its secrets. In the end, it wasn't fingerprints or loud confessions that solved the mystery, but quiet observations, long memories, and the courage to open a door that had been shut for decades. Miss Marple reminded us once again that the smallest details, a trembling hand, a turned lampshade, a name written just slightly wrong, can lead to the deepest revelations. And perhaps more importantly, that time does not forget. It simply waits for someone kind and clever enough to listen. But it leaves us wondering, if you had been in Lydia Crane's shoes, carrying the weight of a wartime secret, and facing the return of a young man you once loved, what would you have done? Would you have spoken the truth? Or, like her, tried to bury it beneath silence?